Entire cities lost half of their population in just a few months. Imagine walking down a street and realizing something has changed. A neighbor who was selling bread just a week ago doesn't open their shop. The priest, who led Mass every day, doesn't leave the church. These diseases were not just a problem, they changed the economy, religion, politics, and people's very understanding of life. The Black Death, the most catastrophic epidemic of the Middle Ages. 1347 to 1353, with repeated outbreaks until the late 14th century. Let's not start with the earliest outbreaks, but with the biggest and most destructive epidemic of the Middle Ages. In the fall of 1347, ships from the Black Sea arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina. The sailors were exhausted, feverish, and many could no longer get out of bed. City authorities initially thought it was just an ordinary illness after a long voyage. But within days, it became clear this was something entirely different. People felt extreme weakness. Temperatures rose so high that their bodies literally burned. Painful swellings appeared on the neck, under the arms, and in the groin, sometimes as large as apples. Head spun, thoughts became confused, and the body ached so much that it was impossible to get up. Chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio wrote that people went to bed healthy, and by morning could no longer rise. Some began to struggle for breath. Others lost their orientation, not recognizing their loved ones. Many felt an unbearable thirst, but water offered no relief. Over the following months, cities changed beyond recognition. Streets emptied. Shops closed. Houses were locked because no one was left to open them. In Florence, chroniclers estimate that 50 to 60% of the population died. In Paris, tens of thousands perished in a short period. In London, cemeteries could no longer accommodate the dead. King Edward III of England in 1348 was forced to close Parliament. The judicial system practically stopped. There was no one to work. Venice and Milan were rare exceptions. They implemented strict isolation measures. In Milan, entire houses were sealed if anyone inside was infected. It seemed harsh, but it helped the city survive the wave more lightly than others. The papal court in Avignon was surrounded by burning fires, believing the smoke purified the air. Pope Clement VI survived the epidemic, but the court around him thinned dramatically. After this epidemic, everything in Europe changed. The value of labor increased sharply. Peasants began demanding more rights. A crisis of the feudal system began. The Black Death was not just a disease. It was a turning point after which the Middle Ages began to slowly fade. Justinian's plague, the first blow to civilization. 541, 544. Recurrent waves until the 8th century. 800 years before the Black Death, the Byzantine Empire experienced something similar. In 541, a disease arrived in Constantinople that would go down in history as Justinian's plague. Chronicler Procopius of Caesarea wrote that it began with slight fatigue, then came fever, then swellings, then mental confusion. People wandered in delirium, not knowing where they were. Some simply collapsed in the streets. Procopius described streets filled with people walking like shadows, unsure who was alive and who was not. Work at the ports stopped. Bread did not always reach the markets. Prices rose. Supply shortages began. One Byzantine official, whose name is lost to history, left a letter complaining that out of 20 clerks, only 3 remained. There was simply no one to manage documents. The empire continued to exist, but at the level of everyday life, it was literally falling apart. Emperor Justinian I himself fell ill. He disappeared from public life for several weeks. Rumors circulated in the palace that the emperor might not survive. Had he died, the political map of Europe could have looked very different. Justinian's plague was the first historical example of how disease could not only strike people, but systematically. It was a moment when it became clear, even the mightiest empire is vulnerable not to armies, but to the invisible. Leprosy, a disease that isolated people, 11th, 14th centuries, especially in the 12th, 13th centuries. This was not a sudden catastrophe, but a long, slow story of challenges. At first, numbness or skin changes appeared, then spots, and gradually sensitivity decreased. Over time, facial features could change, and fingers or joints might become less mobile. For many, the hardest part was not just the physical symptoms, but the feeling that society was beginning to treat them differently. First looks, then whispers, and eventually avoidance. In some cities, people with this condition were given small bells. If a person walked down the street, the bell would alert others to their presence. In France, Records survive of a woman named Adelaide, sent to a special institution. Her husband was considered free, though she continued to live and feel, remaining part of her family and spirit. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem had this condition. He understood that his body was weakening, but continued to carry out his duties and make important decisions. This disease created social rules. People with particular challenges could have limited contact. Later, similar logic appeared in other epidemics. The English sweating sickness, the disease that killed in a day. Recorded in 1485-1551, a very strange disease. Sudden, fast, almost instantaneous, sudden chills, profuse sweating, feeling like your body was overheating from within, headaches, complete weakness. Chroniclers describe cases where a person felt tired in the morning and could no longer get up by the evening. Sometimes the entire process lasted 24 hours. In 1528, the disease reached Hamburg. German chroniclers wrote that wealthy families literally locked themselves in their homes and forbade servants from going outside. Yet it was often the servants who brought the disease, having contact with markets, ports, and travelers. One merchant wrote in a letter that he feared not the streets, but his own house. This disease often affected the nobility and wealthy townspeople. Among the victims were courtiers of Henry VIII. The king was so afraid that he constantly changed residences, avoiding gatherings of people. The English sweating sickness showed that social status offered no protection. In fact, close contacts made the nobility especially vulnerable. It shattered the illusion that wealth equals safety. Smallpox and typhus, the constant background of the Middle Ages, 11th, 15th centuries, recurring. These were not one-off disasters. They were a constant hum in the background of life. Smallpox brought high fever and rashes that left marks for life. Typhus caused fever, confusion, and severe weakness. Smallpox terrified because it left scars that lasted forever. Survivors often carried facial marks that immediately became social indicators. In a society where appearance affected marriage and career, this was not cosmetic. It could alter one's destiny. Royal houses in Europe recorded princesses who, after illness, were considered less advantageous for marriage. A single disease could change not only a person's face, but political alliances. Typhus often accompanied wars and sieges. In overcrowded cities without clean water, it spread rapidly. Soldiers feared not only the enemy, but also the conditions in their camps. These diseases did not appear in chronicles as great catastrophes, but they made the Middle Ages a constant zone of instability. Not one apocalypse, but an endless background threat. For a medieval person, disease was not just a physical trial, it was constant psychological pressure. People lived in expectation. Any discomfort caused anxiety. Any rumor intensified the tension. Prayers, vows, and religious processions became ways to cope not only with physical symptoms, but with the feeling of losing control over one's own life. From these crises emerged a new approach to public health, rising value of labor, weakening of feudal bonds, increasing role of cities, first sanitary rules, the introduction of quarantines in the 14th century, especially in Venice. Medieval people lived with the sense that life could change within weeks. Today the city thrives, tomorrow it may be empty. Today the king is strong, tomorrow he locks himself in his chambers, unsure if he will come out again.